Hi, good morning, everyone. So today is our final lesson on World War One. We made it. One full unit in emergency distance learning. Congratulations. Before I get started into this lecture, I want to thank you all. I've been looking at your work and I've been really impressed. I know I've said this before, but I don't know what I did to deserve such awesome students. But whatever I did, I'm grateful for it because you have all impressed me and given me 110% every single assignment. And I really appreciate it. It makes emergency distance learning a lot more motivational and fun for me as well. So let's go ahead and get started on the end of World War One and the Treaty of Versailles. Hopefully, by now you've already watched this video. It's more battle history than we typically cover. However, I just thought it was a nice way to wrap up how World War One actually ends, and you get to see when Russia pulls out and when the United States comes in. So just to kind of recap and make sure we're all in the same place, by early 1918, Germany looks really strong still, but it actually doesn't have much left. Their economy is starting to crumble because they're solely focused on manufacturing weapons and helping for the war because of total war. And their economy can't take it. Their people can't take it. Your economy can't just be focused on one industry or else it will crumble. By this point, because Russia is out of the war, all war efforts are really mostly focused on the Western Front. As you saw from the video, there are some battles in Africa and in the Middle East, but most of people's attention by 1918 is on the Western Front. And as I mentioned before, Russia is out of the war. They are fighting their own civil war, the Bolsheviks versus the Mensheviks. And Lenin is with the Bolsheviks, and the White Army is the Mensheviks or the anti-Bolsheviks. And as you saw in that video, the United States and the Allies actually fight and help support the Mensheviks. That's not necessarily important for your test, but it will be important when we think about our future relationship with the USSR and with Russia in general. By 1918, we start to see United States troops arriving in the Western Front. Although the United States signs to be a part of the war for a little over a year, we actually don't have troops fighting for very long. So we only see battles for less than a month. And then lastly, this is when we start to see the stalemate break and the Allies moving the war towards a more decisive victory that even Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans know are coming. And this all leads us to November 11th, 1918, which is Armistice Day. And even today, currently, Armistice Day is somewhat of an international holiday. Personally, my family in Canada celebrates Armistice Day quite frequently. And in Canada, it's really popular to have those red poppies as a symbol of remembrance for those who lost their lives. And this all really leads us to then the Treaty of Versailles, which is when we see the global powers all coming together in France in order to figure out what exactly are going to be the terms of surrender and the terms of victory. There are 4 major countries that lead the Treaty of Versailles and 4 major leaders that lead the Treaty of Versailles. Woodrow Wilson is the United States president. George Clemenceau represents France. David Lloyd George represents Great Britain. And Vittorio Orlando represents Italy. And those are really the people that lead this force. You'll notice that Russia is not a part of this, even though they were fighting for the Allies way more than the United States did. But that's because Russia signed out of the war early, so the Allies kind of felt like you don't get to reap the benefits of a Treaty of Versailles agreement. Early on, even before the war ends, when Woodrow Wilson notices that the Allies are most likely going to win, he proposes what is known as his 14 points. And in his 14 points are all things that he believes would lead to everlasting peace. and he presents them to the world. He presents them to the Treaty of Versailles. However, they're really contentious. And I tried to find a short version of them, but they're kind of complicated. So there's really only one point I want you to know, and that's his final 14th point, which is the establishment of a League of Nations. And it turns out this is the only point that actually gets adopted by the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations is the very first international government organization based on maintaining peace. And while we've seen countries come together in the past, right, like the Berlin Conference to try and maintain peace, what's different about the League of Nations is that it's long term. It's not just like 1 or 2 meetings or a meeting for a couple months. No, the League of Nations is supposed to be something that lasts for future generations, for hundreds of years. And the goal is that they're going to solve conflicts through democratic, diplomatic ways. Instead of escalating to war, the idea is that if you had a League of Nations and Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, the League of Nations would have stopped it and intervened early on to prevent these conflicts. Wilson actually wins a Nobel Peace Prize for the creation of the League of Nations, which is a little ironic, as you'll see in a second. Germany is not allowed in the League of Nations, which is really embarrassing for Germany. Russia is also not allowed in to the League of Nations. They are officially allowed in, I believe, in 1935, but they are kicked out in 1936. So Russia does not really get a piece of the League of Nations. The League of Nations has no military, which will become problematic in the future because it's really hard to enforce a diplomatic solution if you have no force behind you. And then lastly, the United States actually declines to join. And this is why it's kind of ironic that this is President Woodrow Wilson's idea, and the United States doesn't even participate. It's not that they aren't allowed, it's that the US rejects it. And the reason for this is because the United States looks at the League of Nations as a future problem. Following World War I, Americans do not like that we were involved in a European conflict. Even though people supported the Allies and felt that this was the right thing to do, it still was a little bit, not a little bit, people lost their lives. It was really tough on Americans. And so people saw the League of Nations as potentially a future way to drag us into the war. So the US Senate said no to this treaty. And in the United States, you can't have a president accept a treaty. It has to be all of Congress. So the US Senate is like, no. And in fact, the United States doesn't even sign the Treaty of Versailles. We have our own treaty because we reject the League of Nations. Anyways, that's kind of just like a fun caveat. But you do need to know that although this is a United States idea, we do not participate. And so what really happens with the treaty? First of all, the blame of World War I gets put completely on Germany, all of it. In fact, there's a war blame clause where Germany has to accept full responsibility for World War I. You may be wondering, like, how is this beneficial? How does this help people? It doesn't. It's like purely a way to just be like, this is your fault. You need to accept responsibility. The cost of war, Germany has to pay $31.4 billion in reparations. Now, if we were to go back to that slide where I was talking about how Germany's economy was already crumbling, you could probably guess that $31.4 billion is not going to be something that Germany can afford. And in fact, this amount pretty much bankrupts all of Germany. The German military is cut down drastically. So remember militarism, this like rise of German military power, rise of the arms race, all of that. Well, Germany's army gets cut so that they can only have 100,000 men, which is a tiny fraction of the millions it used to have. And they could also only have 4 Navy boats, no submarines, or no Air Force. 4 Navy boats. That's pretty much just for show at that point. Germany's colonies, as well as all of the colonies that the Central Powers had, are given back to the original territories, and some of them are actually gain their independence. Alsace-Lorraine is the part of the French and German border that Germany actually took over, and that goes back to French territory. Poland becomes independent. Finland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia also all become independent-ish. They have provisional governments that are overlooked by the League of Nations, but this is still more independence than they had ever seen. Czechoslovakia, Austria-Hungary all break up and become independent. That's why we don't have an Austrian-Hungarian Empire to this day. And pretty much the same thing happens with the Ottoman Empire. They were already in decline before World War I. So at the end of World War I, they're too weak. And by 1922, the Ottoman Empire is done. So what are some pros and cons of this treaty? There must be some good and some bad. Well, some of the pros is that we do start to see a push towards independence, right? Austria-Hungary over here becomes their own nations. We see Croatia, Hungary, Austria, Bohemia, which is like Czechoslovakia, all gaining their own independent nations. All of the countries in red also gain their independence, which becomes a really prideful moment for these people, right? Especially Poland. Poland was taken over by Russia and then Germany and then Russia and then Germany. So to finally be independent is a really big deal for Poland. The League of Nations is absolutely a positive step as well, right? Nations realizing that this can't happen again and thinking of this as future solutions, right? Future oriented. How can we make sure that we turn to diplomacy instead of war? However, the two biggest cons is that one, the United States actually doesn't join the League of Nations. And the United States following World War I becomes strongly isolationist when it comes to Europe. And they want nothing to do with European nations, European conflicts. They'll trade with them. That's totally fine. They just don't want to be dragged into any more of their issues. However, the biggest issue of the Treaty of Versailles is really how they treat Germany. Because Germany is punished so drastically, it doesn't really allow Germany to reflect and problem solve and figure out what went wrong. It just breeds resentment. In Germany, they're embarrassed, they're demoralized, they have no money, their economy is gone, they've lost so many of their citizens. And then to make matters worse, they're not respected. Other countries don't trade with them anymore. They have to take loan after loan after loan. They're not allowed in the League of Nations. And Germany is overwhelmed by this punishment. And I want you to kind of think of that, right? Think about how if you did a serious mistake, like let's say cheated, and I catch you cheating, and my response to you cheating is you get a 0, you get an F in my class. I'm going to tell every future teacher that you cheated, that you probably deserve an F in all of your future classes. How would you feel? That doesn't really give hope that there's an opportunity for redemption. That doesn't really give hope that there's an opportunity to better yourself. And that's kind of how Germany feels in a much more drastic way. So lastly, I want you to take a second. You can write it on your paper. You can just think about it. Predict what some of the long-term consequences of this treaty will be. And I know what you're probably thinking is, World War II, she's already mentioned this. But why exactly? Why would feeling like this guy, so low, so angry, lead to an even worse conflict, lead to a Holocaust, lead to massive casualties? And that's it, you guys. Congratulations again. You have finished an entire unit of distance learning. Round of applause. Anyways, good luck on the test. I'm about to post it. You're all going to do fine. Remember, it's open note. You have 80 minutes. Good luck. Have fun. And I will see you all later.